Sophie screamed as the water grabbed her legs, pulling her towards the river. She tried to kick free, but the force of the water was too strong. "Help!" she cried, but there was no one left to hear her. The river had her in its grip, and no matter how hard she struggled, she couldn't break free. Many years ago, Sophie and Mark, a couple, arrived at a sacred river in Nigeria, which is both hot and cold at the same time. Unknown to them that the river god forbids flashes of any kind by humans, including flashes from cameras. A few villagers sat quietly washing their clothes or filling pots with water. They smiled at Sophie and Mark as they approached, but soon turned their heads away. Sophie didn't notice the strange way the villagers were acting. She was too amazed by the beauty of the river. She raised her camera and aimed it at the water, eager to capture the moment. Click! The sound of the camera echoed softly. Mark was too busy reading his guidebook to notice anything strange, but the villagers began whispering among themselves. With each click of the camera, the water waved slightly, rising a bit higher each time before settling down again. At first, Sophie didn't notice. She kept snapping pictures, muttering to herself about how beautiful everything looked. Click! The river waved again. This time, with a low, quiet sound coming from deep below the surface. The villagers began to panic. One old man stood up, waving his arms vertically at Sophie and Mark. He shouted something strange in a language Sophie couldn't understand, but his voice was filled with urgency. Sophie glanced at him confused. "What is he saying?" she asked, but Mark was too lost in his book to notice. Sophie shrugged and took another picture. Click! This time, the water rose even higher. The old man began shouting louder, pointing at Sophie's camera. But Sophie didn't understand what he was trying to warn her about. Suddenly, the villagers began to scatter. They dropped everything they were holding and ran away from the river. Mothers grabbed their children's hand and ran as fast as they could, leaving their pots of water behind. In just a few seconds, the once crowded riverbank was empty. Sophie's smile faded. "Mark, something is not right," she said, her voice trembling. Before he could respond, the river roared like thunder. The water, which had been calm just moments ago, was now rising higher and higher. It wasn't just waves. It was as if the whole river was lifting itself into the air. Sophie's heart raced. "What's happening?" she gasped, stepping back from the water's edge. She looked around for help, but the villagers were long gone, leaving only the terrifying sound of the angry river behind. Mark dropped his guidebook, finally realizing what was going on. "Sophie, we need to get out of here," he shouted, grabbing her hand. But before they could move, a giant wave of water rose towards them, its dark foamy surface reaching out like fingers. Sophie screamed as the water grabbed her legs, pulling her towards the river. "Help!" she cried, but there was no one left to hear her. The river had her in its grip, and no matter how hard she struggled, she couldn't break free. Mark tried to pull her back, but the water was too powerful. "Sophie!" he shouted, but in an instant she was gone, swallowed by the river's dark waters. The river, as if satisfied, began to calm down once again. The surface became smooth, and the loud roaring sound faded into silence. But Sophie was gone, taken by the river that had once seemed so peaceful. Deep beneath the surface, Sophie struggled to swim. The water was thick and cold, and strange whispers filled her ears. She tried to move, but it was like something was holding her down. Then out of the darkness, she saw them, glowing eyes watching her from all sides. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The glowing eyes came closer, circling her, pulling her deeper into the cold, dark water. She was trapped. Above, the villagers watched from a safe distance, their faces pale with fear. They knew what had happened. They had tried to warn her, but she didn't understand. Now, the river had taken her, and there was no way to bring her back. Deep beneath the river, Sophie felt herself sinking deeper and deeper. But then, everything stopped. The water around her suddenly became still, and the glowing eyes that had circled her disappeared into the darkness. Sophie was left alone, floating in the cold water, unsure of where she was or what would happen next. Just as she was about to lose hope, a figure appeared before her. At first, it was hard to see through the water, but as it got closer, she could make out a tall, handsome man with shimmering skin and glowing eyes. His hair flowed like water and his face was smooth and perfect. Sophie couldn't believe what she was seeing. He was the most beautiful person she had ever seen. The man smiled at her, but there was something unsettling in his eyes. "Sophie," he said in a deep, calming voice, "you have disturbed my river. You have taken something precious from me, and now you must pay the price." Sophie's heart raised. Who are you?" she asked, stammering. "I am the river god," he replied, his eyes glowing brighter. "This river is mine, and everything that happens here is under my control. You do not listen to the warnings of the villagers. You continued to take pictures, and with each click, you woke something deep within the water." "I didn't know," Sophie pleaded, her voice shaky. "I didn't mean to cause any harm. Please let me go." The river god shook his head slowly. "It is too late now. You must stay here with me. But first, you will be made to answer for what you have done." Sophie's heart sank. She didn't know what he meant. But before she could ask, the river god waved his hand and everything around her went dark again. The next thing she knew, she was standing in the middle of the village market. The bright sunlight was gone, replaced by a strange grey sky, and the villagers who had once smiled at her were now staring at her with cold, judging eyes. Sophie felt her legs move, but she wasn't controlling them. It was as if someone else was making her dance. The sound of drums filled the air, and Sophie's body began to move in time with the beats. She didn't recognize the song, but somehow she was singing in the village language. The words that came out of her mouth were strange, foreign, but they flowed from her lips as if she had known them all her life. She danced and sang, her body twirling and swaying in ways she had never danced before. The villagers watched in silence, their eyes following her every move. Sophie could feel their judgment, their disapproval, but she couldn't stop. The river god was making her perform, forcing her to sing about what she had done wrong, how she had disturbed the peace of the river and awakened the anger of the god. Every market day, this happened. Sophie would find herself back in the village, dancing and singing about her mistake. She couldn't control her body. She couldn't stop the words from spilling out. The villagers began to gather just to watch her, whispering among themselves. Some looked at her with pity, others with anger. They knew she was paying for her actions. Back at their home, Mark was confused. He had searched everywhere for Sophie after she disappeared into the river, but he couldn't find her. The villagers avoided him like a plague, their faces tight with fear whenever he asked about her. He didn't understand what was happening. Where has she gone? And why are the villagers acting so strangely whenever I mention her name? One day, on a market day, Mark decided to go to the village center. As he walked through the markets, he noticed a crowd gathered in the square, all watching something intently. Curious, Mark pushed his way through the crowd until he saw her, Sophie. His heart skipped a beat. There she was, dancing in the middle of the market, her feet moving to the beat of the drums, her voice singing in a language he didn't understand. But something was wrong. Sophie looked different. Her eyes were distant, as if she was really there. Her movements were graceful but unnatural, as if someone else was controlling her. "Sophie!" Mark shouted, running toward her, but she didn't respond. She didn't even look at him. She just kept dancing, her body moving in perfect time with the music, her voice singing that strange song. Mark grabbed her hand, trying to pull her out of the dance, but it was no use. It was as if she couldn't even feel him. "Sophie, please," he begged, his voice breaking. "What's happening to you? Come home with me." But Sophie couldn't answer. The river god had her in his grip and she was powerless to stop him. The villagers watched in silence as Mark desperately tried to reach his wife. Some of them shook their heads, whispering among themselves. They knew what had happened. They knew that Sophie had angered the river god and now she was paying the price, but there was nothing anyone could do. As the days went by, Mark tried everything to free Sophie from the river god's control. He went to the elders asking for help, but they simply told him that it was too late. Sophie had broken the rules of the river and now she belonged to the river god. Mark refused to give up. He visited the river every day, calling out to Sophie, begging the river god to release her. But the river remained silent, its surface calm and peaceful as if nothing had ever happened. The villagers warned him to stop, telling him that the river god was powerful and that challenging him would only bring more trouble. But Mark didn't care. He couldn't leave his wife to suffer. Then one night, as Mark sat by the river bank, he heard a voice. It was soft at first, barely more than a whisper, but it grew louder and clearer until he could make out the words. It was Sophie's voice. "Mark," she whispered, "I am still here. Please don't give up on me." Mark's heart raced. "Sophie, where are you? How can I save you?" But before she could answer, the voice faded and the river returned to its quiet, peaceful state. Mark sat by the river bank, tears streaming down his face. The weight of the situation crushed him and all hope seemed lost. He kept whispering Sophie's name as if somehow she could still hear him through the still water. Just then, Mark felt a light tap on his shoulder. Startled, he turned to see a young man standing behind him. The man had a calm, serious expression and his eyes darted around, making sure no one was watching. "Are you the one looking for your wife?" the young man asked in a hushed voice. Mark wiped his eyes and nodded. "Yes, she's been taken by the river god. I don't know what to do." The young man looked around again, then leaned in close. "I can help you," he whispered, "but we need to be careful. The river god's eyes are everywhere." Mark's heart skipped a bit. Could this man really help him? He didn't know who he was or why he wanted to help, but right now he was desperate enough to trust anyone. "How can you help me?" he asked, his voice trembling with a mix of hope and fear. "Not here," the young man said quickly. "Follow me. We need to go somewhere safe." Without another word, the young man began walking away from the river, glancing over his shoulder to make sure Mark was following. Mark hesitated for a moment, but then he stood up and hurried after him, his heart pounding in his chest. The young man led Mark through the village, keeping to the shadows and avoiding the main paths. They passed by the markets, where villagers were still setting up their stores, and then through a narrow alleyway that opened into a quiet, hidden part of the village. Finally, they stopped in front of a small run-down house that looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. The young man pushed open the door and motioned for Mark to enter. "Quick! Inside," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark stepped inside, his mind racing with questions. The house was dark and empty, with only a few pieces of old furniture scattered around. The young man closed the door behind them and then lit a small lantern, casting a dim light across the room. "Sit," the young man said, pointing to a wooden stool in the corner. Mark sat down, his eyes never leaving the young man as he moved around the room, checking the windows and making sure no one was watching. After a few moments, the young man sat across from Mark. "My name is Dapo," he said. "I know what happened to your wife and I know how to get her back, but it won't be easy." Mark leaned forward, desperation in his eyes. "Please, I will do anything. Just tell me how to save her." Dapo nodded slowly and then said to him, "The river god is powerful, yes, but the good news is he can be tricked. There is an axe, an old forbidden one that can weaken his hold over your wife, but it is dangerous, I must say, and it will also cost you." Mark's heart raised. "Cost me? What do you mean?" Dapo leaned in closer, lowering his voice even more. "I will help you perform this act, but you must pay for the materials we need. It is not cheap, and you must be willing to take the risk. Once we start, there is no turning back. And you must also know that if we fail, the river god will not only take your wife, he will come for you too." Mark swallowed hard. The thought of facing the river god sent a chill down his spine, but he couldn't abandon his precious Sophie. "How much do you need?" he asked. Dapo hesitated for a moment and then said, 20,000 naira. I need to buy special herbs and items for this art. Without them, the art won't work." Mark's heart sank. He didn't have that kind of money. Since Sophie had disappeared, he had barely been able to keep himself fed. He looked down at his hands, trying to think of a solution. "I don't have the amount," he said quietly, "but I will find a solution. I will sell whatever I can. Just promise me that it will work." Dapo nodded. "It will work, but you must trust me and be ready when the time comes. We will perform the acts on the next new moon. Until then, gather the money and prepare yourself. And remember," Dapo's voice grew serious, "tell no one about this. If the river god finds out, it will be the end for the both of you." Mark nodded, his mind racing. He would find the money no matter what. He couldn't let Sophie stay trapped with the river god. As he left Dapo's house and walked back to the village, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The trees rustled in the wind, and the river, always in the distance, seemed to whisper his name. Over the next few days, Mark sold everything he could, his wristwatch, and even his tools. He asked for help from anyone who would listen, but the villagers kept their distance. They knew something strange was happening, and they were afraid to get involved. Finally, the night of the new moon arrived. Mark returned to Dapo's house, clutching the money in his hands. He knocked on the door, and Dapo opened it quickly, pulling him inside. "Do you have it?" he asked urgently. Mark handed over the money and Dapo counted it quickly, nodding in approval. Good. Now we can begin. Dapo led Mark to the back of the house where he had set up a small altar. Strange symbols were drawn on the floor in white chalk and candles flickered in the corners of the room. In the center of the altar was a bowl filled with dark murky water. This is the water of the river, Dapo explained. It will help us reach the river god's realm. But once we start, there is no turning back. Are you ready? Mark nodded. His heart pounded. I am ready. Let's do this. Dapo began chanting in a language Mark didn't understand. The room grew colder and the shadows on the walls seemed to stretch and twist. As Dapo's voice grew louder, the water in the bowl began to ripple as if something was stirring beneath the surface. Suddenly, the water in the bowl surged upward, forming into a small swelling vortex. Dapo's eyes widened as he continued to chant. His voice filled with urgency. Now, Mark, Dapo shouted over the sound of the swirling water. Reach into the water and call Sophie's name. Mark hesitated for only a moment before plunging his hand into the cold dark water. Sophie, he shouted, his voice shaky. Sophie, I am here. Come back to me. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the water grew still and the room felt silent. Mark's hand remained in the water, but there was no response. He looked up at Dapo, panic rising in his chest. Is it working? What's happening? Dapo's face was tensed as he watched the water. It's not over yet. Keep calling her name. She has to hear you. Mark closed his eyes and shouted her name again, louder this time. Sophie, please come back. Suddenly, the water in the bowl began to glow with a faint light. The swelling vortex returned, and within it, Mike saw a glimpse of Sophie's face. She looked frightened, her eyes wide as if she was trapped in a nightmare. Sophie, Mark cried, his voice filled with desperation. I'm here. I'm coming for you. But before he could reach her, the light flickered and Sophie's face began to fade. Mark's heart dropped as he saw her slipping away once again. No, he shouted, trying to grab onto her image, but it was too late. The light vanished and the water in the bowl went still once more. Dapo's voice cut through the silence, his tone grim. Something is wrong, he said. The river god, he knows what we are doing. Mark's stomach twisted in fear. What do you mean? Dapo stood up, his face pale. We need to stop. If we continue, the river god might take both of you. Something has angered him. Mark's breath caught in his throat as Dapo's words sank in. The fear that had been gnawing at him since Sophie disappeared tightened his grip. Angered him? Why? We just want Sophie back. Mark's voice trembled, panic rising. Dapo shook his head, pacing around the small room. It's not just about wanting her back. The river god, he doesn't let go easily. When someone is taken, there's always a price to pay. He turned to Mark, his eyes dark. I didn't think it would happen so quickly, but something had made him furious. We need to stop before it is too late. No, Mike yelled, slamming his hand on the table. I won't stop. I can't lose her again. There has to be something else we can do. Dapo rubbed his temples, thinking hard. There is one more way, he said slowly, as if weighing his words. But it is dangerous. more dangerous than anything we have done so far. The river god demands respect. To break his hold on Sophie, you will need to face him directly. Mark stared at him, his heart racing. Face him? How? Dapper took a deep breath and sat down across from Mark, his voice low and serious. At dawn, the river god comes close to the surface. You must go to the river bank alone and call out to him. Offer yourself in exchange for Sophie. Mark felt a cold chill run down his spine. Offer myself? Benny, that was said, nodding gravely. It is the only way. If the river god accepts your offer, he may release Sophie. But if he doesn't, you will be taken as well. Mark felt his stomach turn. The thought of facing the river god terrified him, but he couldn't abandon Sophie. She was his wife, and he loved her more than anything. He would do whatever it took to bring her back. I will do it, Mark said firmly. Whatever it takes, I will face him. Dapper gave him a long, hard look. Wow, you are brave, but you must be prepared. The river god is not like anything you have ever seen. He's old and powerful, and he does not show mercy. Mark swallowed hard, but nodded. I understand. Just tell me what to do. Dapper stood and began gathering supplies. A small bag of herbs, a flask of water from the river, and a piece of cloth with strange symbols painted on it. Take this with you, he said, handing the items to Mark. The herbs will protect you from the river's pool. The water will help you speak the river god's language, and the cloth, it will mark you as someone who comes in peace. Mark took the items, his hands trembling slightly. And then, Dapper looked at him in the eyes, his expression grave. You must go to the river bank at dawn. Stand by the water and call out to the river god. Tell him you offer yourself in exchange for Sophie. If he accepts, he will appear before you. But be warned, once he comes, there is no turning back. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, but he nodded. He had come this far, he couldn't back down now. The hours until dawn felt like eternity. Mark barely slept, his mind filled with thoughts of Sophie and the terrifying encounter he was about to face. As the first light of morning began to creep across the sky, he gathered his courage and made his way to the river. The village was entirely quiet as Mark walked through the streets. Even the birds seemed to be holding their breaths. When he reached the river bank, the water was still and calm, the surface reflecting the pale pink of the morning sky. Mark stood at the edge of the river, clutching the items that were given him. His heart raced, but he took a deep breath and called out into the silence. River god, his voice shook slightly, but he forced himself to continue. I offer myself in exchange for Sophie. Please release her and take me instead. For a moment, nothing happened. The water remained still, and the only sound was the soft rustling of the trees. But then, slowly, the surface of the river began to ripple. The water churned and bubbled, and a low, deep voice echoed across the river bank. Who dares to call me? Mark's blood ran cold. The voice was ancient and powerful, like the rumbling of the earth itself. He swallowed hard and stepped closer to the water. It's me, Mark. My wife Sophie was taken by you. I'm offering myself in her place. Please release her. The water continued to churn, and out of the depths, a figure began to emerge. The river god rose slowly from the water, his form towering over Mark. He was tall and handsome, with smooth dark skin and eyes that gleamed like the depths of the waters. His long flowing hair shimmered with the colors of the water, and his presence was both mesmerizing and terrifying. Mark's knees almost buckled as the river god fixed his gaze on him. "You think you can offer yourself in our place?" the god asked, his voice cold and mocking. Mark nodded, his throat dry. "Yes, I love her. Please let her go." The river god's eyes narrowed and he moved closer, the water swelling around his feet. "You speak of love, but do you understand the price of what you ask? I do not take souls lightly. Once given, they belong to me." Mark's heart pounded in his chest, but he stood his ground. "I understand. Take me, but let Sophie go." The river god was silent for a moment, studying Mark with an unreadable expression. Then a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Very well," he said softly. "I will release your wife. But know this, once you are mine, you will never leave my realm." Mark's stomach churned, but he nodded. "I accept." The river god's smile widened and he raised his hand. The water around him began to glow, and from its depths, Sophie's form began to rise. She looked pale and weak, her eyes wide with fear, but she was alive. "Sophie!" Mark cried, rushing toward her. But before he could reach her, the river god held up his hand, stopping him in his track. "Not so fast," he said coldly. "You had made your choice. Now it is time for you to fulfill your end of the bargain." Mark froze, his heart sinking. He looked at Sophie, tears streaming down his face. "I love you," he whispered. "I am sorry." Sophie's eyes filled with confusion and terror. "Mark! No! You can't do this!" But it was just too late. The river god reached out, his hand wrapping around Mark's hand, pulling him towards the water. Mark felt the icy grip of the river closing in around him, dragging him down. As Mark disappeared beneath the surface, the last thing he saw was Sophie standing on the riverbank, screaming his name. The river god's laughter echoed in his ears as the water closed over his head and darkness swallowed him whole. Dapper stood at the riverbank, his heart racing as he watched Mark disappear beneath the water. The river god's laughter echoed in the air, chilling him to the bone. Sophie collapsed to the ground, tears streaming down her face. She sobbed, her whole body trembling, calling out Mark's name over and over. Dapper didn't know what to do. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He thought the river god would release Sophie in exchange for Mark. But now, everything had gone wrong. He hesitated, torn between helping Sophie and running away from the danger. But seeing Sophie so broken made him decide he couldn't leave her like that. "Sophie," that was said softly, kneeling beside her. "We have to go. We need to talk to the village elders. They are the only ones who can help us now." Sophie barely understood his words through her sobs, but she nodded weakly. Dapper helped her to her feet, supporting her as they walked away from the river. The journey to the village felt long and heavy. Dapper's mind raced, trying to figure out what he could say to the elders. He had never asked them for such a big favor before. Would they even agree to help? When they arrived at the village, the people stared at Sophie with fear and curiosity. They knew what had happened. Everyone had heard the river god's anger and seen the strange events at the river. Some whispered, pointing at Sophie, but no one approached. That will lead Sophie to the village square where the elders sat in a circle under a large tree. They were old and wise, their faces lined with years of experience. Dapo had grown up respecting these men, knowing they had the power to making important decisions for the village. As they reached the elders, Dapo bowed deeply, his heart pounding in his chest. Sophie stood beside him, clutching his hand for support. She didn't know what to expect, but she knew this was her only chance to save Mark. Elders, Dapo began, his voice shaking slightly. I come before you with a great problem. The river god had taken this woman's husband, and she begs for your help to bring him back. The elders looked at Sophie, their faces serious. One of them, a tall man, spoke first. The river god's anger is not something we take lightly. Why has it taken her husband? Dapo hesitated, then explained the story. He told them how Sophie had angered the river god by taking pictures at the river, not knowing it was forbidden. He spoke of how Mark had offered himself in exchange for Sophie. As he spoke, Sophie stood silently beside him. She didn't understand their language, but she could feel the weight of the situation. She pleaded quietly in English, her voice soft but filled with desperation. Please help me. I didn't mean to anger the river god. I just want my husband back. One of the elders, a smaller man with the sharp eyes, looked at Sophie and then at Dapo. What is she saying? He asked. Dapo quickly translated Sophie's words, his voice urgent. She's begging for your help. She didn't know the rules of the river. She only wants to save her husband. The elders murmured among themselves, their expressions thoughtful. Finally, the oldest elder, who had remained silent until now, raised his hand. The others fell quiet. This is a grave matter, the elder said slowly, his deep voice full of authority. The river god is not easily appeased, but we have seen the strength of this woman's love for her husband. Perhaps there is something we can do. Sophie's heart leaped with hope as she saw his serious expression. She stepped forward, her hands clasped together. Please, she said softly, her eyes filled with tears. I will do anything. Just help me bring my Mark back. Dapo quickly translated her words again, and the elders nodded, understanding her desperation. The oldest elder sighed, rubbing his hands together. There is a way to calm the river god, he said, his voice low, but it will require a sacrifice. Sophie's heart sank. A sacrifice? She whispered, looking at Dapo for help. Dapo hesitated before translating the elder's words. Yes, Sophie, he said softly. To bring back Mark, the village must offer something of great value to the river god. It is the only way to appease him. Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes. She didn't know what kind of sacrifice they were talking about, but she knew it would be a heavy price. What kind of sacrifice? She asked, her voice trembling. The elder looked at her with deep, sorrowful eyes. It could be anything that the river god desires, something precious to the village or to those who seek his favor. The next day, the villagers gathered around the square, murmuring and whispering to one another. They knew that a sacrifice to the river god was no small matter. Some looked at Sophie with pity, while others seemed fearful of what might be asked of them. Sophie's hands shook as she wiped the tears from her eyes. She looked at Dapo, hoping for some kind of answer or reassurance, but he seemed just as confused as she was. What do we do now? Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dapo turned to the elders, his expression desperate. Please, he begged, help us understand. What kind of sacrifice will the river god accept? The eldest elder was silent for a moment before speaking. "We will consult the spirits tonight," he said. "They will guide us on what must be done. Until then, the woman must remain in the village. No one is to disturb her." Sophie felt a wave of relief mixed with fear. At least there was still hope, but she didn't know what the spirits would say. Would the price be too high to save Mark? Could she even pay it? Dapo nodded respectfully to the elders. "Thank you," he said quietly. Then he turned to Sophie and gently guided her away from the square. "Come, we will rest for now." As they walked back to Dapo's small house, Sophie's mind raced. She couldn't stop thinking about Mark, trapped somewhere under the river, and the mysterious sacrifice that might be needed to bring him back. When they got to Dapo's house, Sophie sat down crying, her heart heavy with fear and sadness. Dapo tried to comfort her, but she could see the worry in his eyes too. Neither of them knew what would happen next, and the uncertainty was almost unbearable. But deep inside, Sophie knew one thing for sure. No matter what the cost, she would do whatever it took to save Mark. The night crept in slowly, and the village became quiet. Sophie and Dapo waited, the air thick with tension. What would the spirits reveal? What would the river god demand? The answers were still hidden, but they would soon come open. The elders gathered under the larch tree once again, preparing to seek the guidance of the spirits. Sophie and Dapo watched from the side, their hearts pounding with anticipation. The village had fallen into a great silence, as if even the trees and the wind were holding their breaths. Finally, after what felt like hours, the eldest of the village elders stood up. His face was solemn, and his voice carried the weight of the spirit's message. "The spirits have spoken," he announced. The villagers gathered around the square, eager to hear the verdict. The elder turned to Sophie, his eyes grave but kind. "You must carry a sacrifice to the river god," he said. "The sacrifice must be placed on your head, and you are to wear only a white wrapper. You will walk from the middle of the village to the river bank, where you will present the offering. Only then will the river god release your husband." Sophie's heart pounded. The idea of facing the river god again terrified her, but she knew she had no choice. If this was what it took to save Mark, she would do it. "I will do it," she said, her voice firm, despite the fear gnawing at her inside. The elders nodded in approval. They handed Sophie a small wooden tray filled with fruits, flowers, and a clay pot of water. Dapo gently wrapped the white cloth around her as she tied it securely. The villagers watched in silence, their eyes full of hope and fear. With the sacrifice balanced on her head, Sophie stood tall, her heart beating like a drum. The path to the river seemed longer than she remembered, but she took a deep breath and began to walk. As Sophie made her way through the village, the people cleared the path, their eyes never leaving her. They knew the power of the river god, and they knew this was her only chance. Sophie walked carefully, her feet barely making a sound on the dusty ground. Dapo followed at a respectful distance, his face full of worry. When she finally reached the river bank, the water was calm, glistering under the moonlight. The river god's presence was heavy in the air, as if he was watching her every move. Sophie gently placed the tray of offerings by the water edge, her heart pounding in her chest. She stood there holding her breath, waiting for something to happen. The air was still, and for a moment, she thought the river god wouldn't respond. Then, slowly, the water began to ripple. The surface shimmered, and the river god's voice boomed from the depths. It wasn't angry this time, but it was still filled with power. "You have brought the sacrifice," the river god said, his voice echoing across the river. "You have done what I asked. Sophie stood frozen, staring at the water. She wanted to run, but something held her in place. She needed to see what would happen next. The river began to part, the waters rising in soft waves. And then, out of the mist, Mark appeared. His clothes were drenched and his face was pale, but he was alive. Sophie's heart leaped for joy. "Mark!" she cried, running toward him. Tears of relief streamed down her face as she embraced him, her body shaking with emotion. Mark held her tightly, his voice soft. "Sophie, you saved me." But before they could celebrate, the river god spoke again, his voice filled with warning. "You are free to leave, but let this be a lesson to you both. When you step into another man's land, you must first ask questions. Know the rules before you act or face the consequences." Sophie and Mark both nodded, their hearts full of gratitude but also fear. They had learned the lessons the hard way. The river god's words echoed in their minds as they turned to leave, holding each other tightly. As they walked away from the river, the water calmed once more, returning to its quiet, peaceful state. The villagers who had been watching from a distance slowly approached, their faces full of relief and awe. They knew the danger had passed and they welcomed Sophie and Mark back with warm, forgiving smiles. Dapo, who had been watching from the edge of the village, breathed a sign of relief. He had been worried about what might happen. But now, seeing Sophie and Mark reunited, he felt a weight lift from his chest. Sophie looked at him and smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice full of emotion. "We couldn't have done this without you." Dapo smiled back, though his heart still carried the weight of all they had been through. "That was the least I could do," he replied. And just then the elders approached, their faces tanned but kind. "The river god has forgiven you," the elder's elder said, with his voice soft. "But remember his warning. Whenever you go to a strange land, either for documentation, sightseeing, or for fun, ask questions before you carry out your activities." Sophie nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of the lesson. "We won't forget," she promised. With that, Sophie and Mark made their way back to the village, their hands clasped tightly together. They had been through so much, and now they understood the importance of respect and caution when stepping into unfamiliar places. As they walked away from the river, the village slowly returned to its usual calm. The danger had passed and life would go on, but Sophie and Mark would never forget the lesson they had learned. The importance of asking questions and respecting the tradition of every land they visited. Hey, African Tales by Kama Tribe, how are you all doing? For me, I am doing just fine. I believe you have learned one or two things from the stories, and it will be a great pleasure to read from you in the comment section. I promise to respond to all the comments as I've always done. If you like the story, kindly give it a thumbs up, and please share out to your loved ones, especially to people who travel around the globe. If you love what Kama is doing and you want to be a support to me, kindly use the link on my bio or the link on the description of this video to buy me coffee. Or you can as well buy me a super thanks by simply clicking on the super thanks icon. If you have not joined Kama's tribe, what are you waiting for? Kindly click on that subscription button and subscribe to this channel. Until I bring another interesting story your way, it is a goodbye from here, and God bless you.